This is Dyke Henderson, and this is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. We meet each Tuesday at 2 o'clock, and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Today, we have a great guest. It's John Macone, and he is the Policy Director and Outreach Director for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. John, thank you very much for being on the show and talking to people both on radio and television.
Oh, thank you, Dyke, for inviting me. I appreciate it.
John's going to be talking about climate change in the Merrimack Valley. He's got some slides. They're very interesting. And John, I'm going to turn it over to you now. Again, thank you for being with us, and I look forward to seeing your presentation on climate change in the Merrimack River.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dyke. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through a slideshow that I gave in Newburyport last week about what's going to be happening with climate change as it comes into the Merrimack Valley, specifically how it's going to impact the Merrimack River and some of the side effects that are going to happen in Newburyport, particularly with its water supply. So we're going to talk about just what is this Merrimack Valley? I'm sure people have heard of it. Where is it? Well, this is a graphic that shows you where all this water that comes through Newburyport comes from. So the Merrimack River Valley is in, about a third of it is in Massachusetts, 2/3 in New Hampshire. It goes up to Lake Winnipesaukee, Franconia Notch area, part of Mount Monadnock, Mount Wachusett in Massachusetts. So this is a huge area, about 5,000 square miles of water that's coming down this river and exiting through Newburyport. So when we think about the Merrimack, we need to look at, okay, what's happening upstream from us in terms of climate change, and how is it impacting the river as it goes by? So just a few examples. People think about climate change, it's going to happen in the future. Well, it's happening right now. So what this graphic I'm showing now is, you may recall last July was really hot. So this is a graphic that was produced by NOAA, our National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that documents how hot it was in the United States. And the red areas are places that had record warmth. If you can see this graphic, you can see that the entire Merrimack River Valley had its hottest July ever. So this is a sign of climate change that we're actually feeling. Another thing that happened with us was just a few months later, we had an extreme drought, and that was starting around August and September. So this is an unusual situation, but this is another thing that's happening due to climate change, that we're seeing these extremes in weather. And this is going to be something that's going to be normal for us in the future. So even last week, we saw an example of climate change. If you looked up in the sky, it was beautiful blue skies, but you could also see this very thin haze across the sky around Newburyport. And that was because there were massive out of control wildfires happening in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Canada. And that smoke was so dense, it was actually blowing over us and over most of the eastern seaboard of the United States. So, we're starting to see these global impacts that are hitting our local area. So what does our future look like? Well, it's thought that perhaps by the year 2100, New England is going to feel more like Virginia does right now. The difference being that we're going to have these really heavy rainstorms, and on this side of the coin, we're going to have droughts. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to walk you through what a year is going to be like living here in the near future, if not right now, really. So our new winters, we're going to see a lot less snow, especially in this area of the Merrimack River Valley. In fact, we're probably going to have snowless winters. Winters in general are warming up at a rate much faster than summers in New England. So that dense snowpack that we see up in the White Mountains, that's going to be reduced dramatically. And the real cold winter that they have in that part of the Merrimack River Valley is going to be reduced into about half of what it is now. So this is going to introduce this kind of new season for us. Instead of having these cold winters of freezing, we're going to have this muddy season where nothing is really growing because it's too cold for that, but we don't have a real frozen ground, and we don't have a lot of snow. So this is going to be strange for us, but this is what winter may start to look like. Another thing that's going to be happening, according to NOAA, is we're going to see a significant increase in heavy rainfall events during the winter and spring. So instead of snow, we're going to get these big downpours that are going to hit us very, very suddenly and be pretty harsh. In fact, the Northeast is already seeing these kind of events start happening at a much faster rate, a more intense rate than the rest of the country. So what does that mean for us? Well, it's a much greater risk of floods in the winter and the spring due to these big storms. It also increases the risk of combined sewage overflow and runoff contamination into the river. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another thing that's happened historically in the river is something called a freshet. And that's when the snow melts in the north and we get a much heavier flow on the river for, it could be days or weeks of a constant heavy flow. And that's probably going to dissipate very much because we're not going to have that snow. And the thing about freshets are that they're part of this ecology of this area. They introduce certain kinds of beneficial nutrients into the river system. And they're also a trigger for certain kinds of fish that come up the river to spawn. So we're going to see that phenomenon reduce, and we're not sure what that impact is going to be on our environment, but we will be finding out. So another thing that's going to be a big change is what summer is going to be like. And we always say here in New England, if you don't like the weather in New England, wait a minute. And so we're going to change that. To if you don't like the weather in New England, wait a few days. So why is that? Well, this is part of what's happening globally, is that the jet stream that controls our weather is being affected by climate change. It's slowing down. And what that results in is that you get a certain kind of weather that will hover over your region for, instead of a short period, for a long period, say days. So as we experienced last year, with this long drought period, no rain. That's unusual for New England. We're going to be seeing more of that. And we're probably also going to be seeing these really intense storms that are caused by this new jet stream pattern that are going to hit us and stay over us for a little while and then move on. And then we'll have another period of long drought. So these really intense rainstorms, they're not good for our environment. It's much better to have a long, kind of steady, slower rain, because the ground really can't absorb the rainwater when it comes down really hard and fast. I mean, you see it run down the streets and it runs out into the river. So it's not really helping the plants the way it should, or environment for that matter. It's going to be hotter, we know that. We've already been feeling that. We're going to have more heat waves in the future. We're already starting to feel that. And if we have these periods of drought, we're going to see the Merrimack itself reduce in the amount of water that flows down it. So I've got a graphic here I'm showing that shows the period from beginning of July to the end of September of last year. And if you can see this graph, there are yellow markers on it that show you the norm of what the Merrimack would be flowing at, which is about 2,000 cubic feet per second. And that's about 1.3 billion gallons a day. This is in Lowell. Last year, it was flowing at about half that rate. So it's slowing way down. Okay, what does that mean for the river? Well, I'll show you. For one thing, when the river slows down, it's not flushing out the different kinds of nutrients that are getting pushed into it. And so we get these toxic algae blooms that develop. And these can be dangerous for humans and for wildlife. We also have an impact where the the ecology of this region is changing, because we're not getting the amount of rain that we used to have. And we're also seeing that there's stronger winds. So I don't know if there are folks on your show who go out hiking, and maybe you've noticed that there are more trees that have been knocked down than perhaps you've seen in the past. And that's because of this new climate that we're encountering. Trees are getting dried out, and then they're hit by these intense storms that have a lot of wind, and they break and they fall down. So, you know, trees, we know the importance of trees. We all love trees, I think, but one of the most important things about trees when it comes to the Merrimack is they are our best line of defense against pollution running into the river. So if we see lots of trees going down, we might see erosion happening, as in this photo. It's a stretch of riverfront in New Hampshire that's eroding, where there's no trees. And contamination is getting into the river. So we want to try to stop that. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the river's also heating up, and that is going to impact certain kinds of fish species. For example, trout are a cold water fish. And when you see the river getting into the upper 80s, which it does, or maybe even to the 90s in some areas, that's something that can trigger fish kills. So that's going to change our environment in the Merrimack. So I mentioned we're going to have this weird dichotomy of really dry periods, and then we're going to have these intense storms. So here's some pictures from Newburyport in just recent years of the impact of some of these storms of rainwater rushing down and flooding sections of Newburyport. And that's going to happen all throughout the Merrimack River Valley. So we're getting back to the subject of combined sewer overflows and what's going on with them. So this is a chart that shows our combined sewage overflows by year since 2013 through 2020. We average about a little over 500 million gallons a year. And you can see it goes up and it dips down. And that is all a function of rain. So in these years where you see it dip way down, those are years that were pretty dry. And years where it's pretty wet, it goes way up. So it can range from a low of about 350 to a high of 850 in recent years. That's 850 million gallons. That's a considerable amount of sewage. And this is a graphic that shows you where is that sewage coming from. So about 45% comes from Manchester, New Hampshire, 38% from Lowell, and the other three communities that have CSOs account for the rest, you know, a little less than 20%. So Manchester and Lowell are the two biggest sources, and trying to help them manage this problem is what we're focused on. Give you a little bit more info about CSOs. You know, how often do they happen? Well, here's a graphic from 2018, which was a pretty wet year. We had 29 days on which we had CSO events. So not all of those were really big events. I've broken it down so you can see some of the big ones. We had 7 that were pretty large. You know, some of them were over 50 million gallons, and that's a substantial amount of pollution coming into the river. The following year, which was more of an average year, we had about 24 CSO events during the summer, and they were on a slightly smaller size than the year before, but still substantial. We had 6 really good-sized events that happened that year. So when we have an event like this, the river is unsafe for people for about 2 days after the event happens. So, you know, you take that number 24 and you multiply it by 2, you're getting to a month and a half of days that the river isn't good for swimming in. So one other example I wanted to point out. So climate change, we're seeing these impactful storms that happen where we get a lot of sewage that suddenly goes into the river. And we had one of those events April 29th and 30th of this year. We know of at least 86 million gallons that went in that one storm. That's a lot of sewage for one storm. And what did that mean for Newburyport? Well, we've been doing water testing in Newburyport to help Newburyport to develop a early warning system for people against CSOs. So we did a test and we found that there were 1,400 colony forming units per 100 milliliters. That's a measurement you use. 1,400, that is about 7 times the limit that the state has for people to have primary contact, meaning like swimming or wading or getting into the water. So that there was one particular day it was really high. So that's one of the concerns that we have with these CSOs is you can have a day or a couple of days when, boy, you really don't want to be in the river because you could get very sick. So 2016, people might remember that the Merrimack was listed as one of the top 10 most endangered rivers in the United States. Now talk about why that was why it was named that and why there's a relation to climate change. So the reason was really that the Merrimack has a large area of land, is particularly in New Hampshire, that's undeveloped. And that area is starting to see much more development happening. And as it gets developed, you're going to have a lot more driveways and roadways and parking lots, areas that water can wash off of when it rains very quickly, and then it gets into streams quickly, and then it gets into the river really quickly, and it's flushing contaminants with it. So we want to look to ways to manage this so that this kind of pollution doesn't happen. Just to give you a little bit of context, so about almost 18% of this Merrimack River watershed is protected land. And that sounds pretty good on the surface, but compare it to these numbers. Almost 25% of Massachusetts as a state is protected land, and almost 31% of New Hampshire is protected land. So the Merrimack River Valley is way behind in terms of protection of land within the watershed. So that's a statistic that we'd like to see change. We'd like to see more of this land protected because we're going to have these bigger storms. We're going to have more waste and pollution that washes into the river. And there's 600,000 people right now that drink out of this river. So protecting that water source is very important. So I'll talk a little bit about the impact on Newburyport, one of the impacts from climate change and what's going on with the Merrimack. So Newburyport's primary water source is the Artichoke Reservoir, which is located on the line between Newburyport and West Newbury. So I have it marked right here. And there's a key piece of infrastructure that the city is concerned about. And I'll show you it. This is a picture of this, what's called the Lower Artichoke Spillway. And you can see this thing if you're driving along Route 113, if you're passing over the line between Newburyport and West Newbury, you look off and you see this thing looks like a very low dam. So on the opposite side of that from you is Newburyport's water supply. On the closer side is the Artichoke River, which connects directly into the Merrimack. So what the city is worried about is that with climate change, we're seeing the ocean levels rising. Merrimack is a tidal river, so it rises and falls with the tide. And let's say you have a rising tide, much higher tide than you might normally have. And you also have one of these intense rainstorms where lots of CSO waste and pollution gets into the river. It's very possible that water can back up and go over this dam and go into Newburyport's water supply. So the city is worried about this, and it needs to replace this spillway, which is actually going to be a pretty expensive project. And I believe it's in the millions of dollars actually to fix this problem. So that's a bill that's going to come before people in Newburyport. But it's a expense that's going to protect your water supply from climate change. So it's an important sort of issue to be. So there's a lot of information I just threw at you, a lot of, oh my gosh, what's going on? How do you fix this? So just a few things that are happening. One is we're creating this alert system for the entire Merrimack River and actually for the whole state, so that people know when these CSOs happen, so you can know to stay out of the water. And another piece of this is it keeps this in your minds that, hey, there's sewage going into this river. We've got to do something about it. So a piece of this is public information, so that we keep our eye on the ball and we get this CSO problem fixed, because it's very expensive to fix it. There are a lot of sewer system upgrades that are happening right now, which is great news. Manchester, I mentioned 45% roughly of the problem. It's spending almost $250 million over the next 20 years to fix its sewage problems. And it's expecting by the time it's done that it'll reduce the amount of CSO that goes into the river by about 70%. So that's a big change. That's a good change. Lowell is doing something similar, not as expensive, but it's also going to reduce it by about 70%. So those are big chunks of well-spent money. So we're seeing more money that's in attention that's coming in, really because people are getting involved and they want change. They want to see this fixed. So that's good to see. Cities and towns up and down the Merrimack are also preparing for this change. We're having these municipal vulnerability preparedness plans created. And so they're going through and they're identifying, okay, what are the problems in our community that we could face when we have droughts and we have huge rainstorms? How do we fix it? That's happening town by town throughout the Merrimack River Valley and across the state, really. So those are all great things to be seeing happening. There's also resiliency planning. There's organizations, a number of them, that are buying land that needs to be protected, so that we have these buffers that protect us from the sewage that's coming, from the pollution that might be coming into the river source. For example, Greenbelt in Essex County is buying land, like forest land, along the Merrimack and protecting that. And in the city of Lawrence, Groundwork Lawrence is buying city property and returning it to a much more natural state, particularly in areas that flood. And that's just good planning. That's the right thing to be doing. And there are dozens of other organizations, but I just picked these two out as a couple examples that are local. Also doing more watershed planning, looking at this here. I showed you that map of the Merrimack River Basin, and look at that and think, okay, how do we protect this basin? Merrimack Conservation Partnership about 6-8 years ago developed a plan based on scientific surveys that they did, say, okay, here are certain areas of the Merrimack River Basin, this watershed area, that we really ought to focus our time and money on. So we have that document, and now we're really starting to put it into action. So Merrimack River Watershed Council is just recently gotten a couple of grants to help to put some of those ideas into practical use of actually protecting very large swaths of land throughout New Hampshire. So we often get the question from people, is there something I can do? And yeah, there's stuff we can all do. I was talking to a person who's the head of the EPA Water Division in our area and asked him that question. He said, well, it's all these little things you hear about. If more people could do the little things, it really adds up. So what are little things? Well, if you're a new reporter, I'd suggest you read this document. It's on the city's website, New Report Climate Resiliency Plan. Just thumb through it. It's really long, but you're going to get a sense of what the city is doing and what its needs are in the future. So when these issues come up to spend money on these things, you can understand, okay, that's why we're doing it. All right, that makes sense. And you get a feel for how New Report is preparing itself. On your own, there's some real basic stuff. If you can put on solar panels, that's great. Maybe you don't have to use your car as much, or you can get electric car, or reduce your energy use. Those are all good things that help to control emissions that are fueling climate change. And you can think about what we call your water footprint, which means how much water do you use? Can you get by less watering of your lawn? Maybe you don't need a lawn. There are people who aren't using lawns anymore. Or you can put in rain barrels so you can collect water. And when you have these big rainstorms, and keep them on your property, keep that water and then use it when you need it. It's better to keep it on your property than let it flush off into the streets and the street drains. Also, another thing that's kind of poisoning our rivers is the fertilizers that we use. They have a lot of nitrogen and phosphates, like unnaturally high levels that you don't find in nature. And that gets flushed into the rivers, and it causes these algae blooms and other sort of toxic problems that are completely man-made. So that's something that people should think about, that there's other ways to fertilize your land. Let's be a good steward. Dog poop is a big problem, and because that flushes into our water sources. Pick it up. If you've got a dog, just make sure that you don't leave it outside. Plant trees. Trees are an excellent protection against all sorts of things, erosion, heat. When we have pockets of heat, trees will cool the planet. They'll absorb water, they'll absorb pollution. So trees are one of our best protections. Just help a tree. And then there are ways to help out. Join local organizations that are active in trying to solve climate change problems. You can volunteer or look for projects in your own neighborhood that you think you can do that would improve situations. And maybe most importantly is try to make sure that your voice is heard, because it makes a big difference if you're out there and you're writing letters to the editor, or posting things on social media, or talking to your neighbors, or contacting your public officials in some way. Let them know what your priorities are, because this makes a big difference. We've seen this happen as recently as a couple of years ago when we had this CSO notification bill. It was really fueled by people from the Merrimack River Valley who were concerned about CSOs, and they wanted to see the state make a change. So this is something we can do. It sounds like this is an impossible task, but this is a picture I'm showing right now of the Nashua River, which feeds into the Merrimack, and this is about 50 years ago. It's bright red from dye that was being dumped into. The river was so polluted. It's hard to, and there was no sewage plants. Hard to imagine, I'm sure back then, how you could solve this problem, but it happened. We figured out how to do it, and we stayed true to the course. And now the Nashua has been deemed a wild and scenic river, much more beautiful. It's not red anymore. It's natural water, and much, much cleaner than it was 50 years ago. So, these are problems. A lot of these are man-made problems, and we are able to solve them if we put our minds to them. So that's my presentation, Dyke.
Well, thank you very much, John. That was a great presentation. I learned a lot. Your slides were great. Thank you for listening to 99.63 radio and local cable channel 9. We will be back next Tuesday, another time, with Life Along the Merrimack. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Dyke.